Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's food safety webinar, Worker Health, Hygiene, and Training. This webinar will focus on the potential for contamination associated with anyone who works on a produce farm and covers basic adult learning concepts to consider when training anyone working on your farm. We will cover ways in which monitoring and corrective action can occur, when problems are identified, and basic policy development if you hire workers, types of facilities and resources that should be made available to workers to help keep your operation in compliance with food safety requirements. This webinar is part of a series of food safety webinars coordinated and conducted by the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative to help Native American farmers, ranchers, and food producers to begin to understand the importance of food safety and what is necessary to reach compliance under the Food Safety Modernization Act. Attendees will learn about produce safety, foodborne pathogens, worker health, wildlife, land use, post-harvest handling, and legal issues associated with food safety in Indian country. This series is part of a twofold effort to reach producers and food businesses. The IFAI has also launched a series of two-day in-person events in regional locations. I encourage you to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/foodsafety for a listing of these hands-on trainings and information about how to register. The in-person grower training events will result in the award of a certificate. The webinars we are hosting will help prepare you for understanding these issues and will help prepare you to participate more deeply in the grower training events. We will not award a certificate for the webinar trainings. We merely are trying to broaden knowledge of the important principles that will be covered in the two-day grower training events. If you look at the handout section of your control panel, you'll find the slideshow being presented today. I invite you to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/foodsafety, where you'll find more information about our food safety trainings, downloadable copies of the presentations, and archived videos of the completed webinars. The issues we will cover in business practices, microbiology, and legal issues are additional information our experts think is important to have access to as a grower. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. Today's presenter, Janie Hipp, will take questions at the end of the presentation. Attendees can either use the control panel to raise their hand or submit a question by using the questions feature of the control panel. Today's presentation is possible through a 3-year cooperative agreement between the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the IFAI to provide Native American outreach, training, technical assistance, and education to ensure compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Our work is part of the broad efforts we will undertake to provide outreach, training, technical assistance, and education on food safety issues. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Janie Sims Hipp, Director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. Janie is a Chickasaw Nation citizen and founding director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. She has been a licensed attorney in Oklahoma for more than 30 years and specializes in food and agriculture law and Indian law. Prior to launching the initiative, she served in the Obama administration as the senior advisor for tribal relations to Secretary Tom Vilsack, and prior to her appointment within the office of the secretary, she served in the National Institute of Food and Agriculture at the USDA as the national program leader for farm financial management education, trade adjustment assistance, and the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program. She also served at the USDA Risk Management Agency as the Risk Management Education Director. Janie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to begin moving through the slides today, and as Brian indicated, they are available in your panel off to the side. You can download. Today we're going to be talking about some things, and as I was reviewing these slides last night again, I just kept reminding myself that a lot of the things that are covered in this particular chapter of the trainings is a lot of common sense and a lot of things that your grandma might remind you of. But it's helpful to really think about them, the points that are brought out in this particular chapter, in just in a new framework, and really looking deeply at your growing operation, no matter what size it is or where it is or what you're doing or what you're growing, in a new way, because the important components that are brought out in this particular worker health, hygiene, and training chapter are really important in terms of being able to not only monitor what's happening on your farm, but also to prepare yourself should your farm ever be inspected, or should you ever wish to have GAP certification or anything of the nature that would require someone other than yourself to come onto your farm and actually take a look at what you're doing to certify for food safety compliance. And no matter who that is, whether it's tribal or federal, or a third-party auditor, or some other entity that is trying to help you make sure that the food that's grown on your farm doesn't somehow inadvertently get exposed to foodborne pathogens that can create problems down the supply chain. And so a lot of the things you might hear me talk about today are going to seem like things that you learned in grade school, and that's okay, because sometimes it is important to remind ourselves of these concepts. So we're going to talk about some potential routes of contamination that literally can happen through the people who work with you on the farm itself. And although we talk about these things in terms of workers, they also these pathogens can be introduced through visitors to your farm, or volunteers to your farm, or people who come onto your farm site regularly. And so just kind of being aware of all of the potential routes of contamination, regardless of whether it's somebody who's being paid to work with you or someone who is volunteering or is a regular visitor. We're going to talk about worker training programs. We're going to discuss monitoring that facilities are maintained properly on the farm. We're going to describe some corrective actions that can be used to correct identified problems. And we're also going to be talking about record keeping. One thing you'll notice if you are tuned in to all of this webinar series is that record keeping keeps coming up a lot. And there are resources available to you. We're going to continue to kind of curate those resources and make them available on our website to you in terms of just simplified record keeping tools that you can use, so you don't have to try to create one out of whole cloth. But the important thing for us to all kind of keep in mind is that humans can carry pathogens. The Shigella, the hepatitis A, the norovirus, and many others can actually be transmitted onto the farm by human contact. And so that can occur in a variety of ways. Most often it's going to occur in the harvesting and packing kind of activities that occur. But it's also important to talk about the fecal-oral route of transmission of human pathogens. We'll get into that in just a few minutes. And then also it's important to think about how to do your training in such a way, particularly with people who are on your farm a lot, so that proper hand washing and how to handle illnesses and injuries becomes just a normal part of your operation that folks don't think twice about. They just automatically do. But pathogens can spread through saliva and mucus. They can spread through contact with contaminated surfaces. For example, hands can become contaminated while eating, smoking, or sneezing when you're not even touching the produce yet with regard to harvesting or packing. And then if proper cleanliness is not maintained, then you can actually spread the pathogens that your hands become contaminated with during eating, smoking, or sneezing. It's important, and we're going to say it over and over again today, that workers must wash their hands at times where the hands have the highest likelihood of becoming contaminated, and that worker training should include how to wash your hands, and workers should be given opportunities to practice those skills during your ongoing training of them. And finally, that they need to have some training on what to do when they become ill or injure themselves while working. The focusing as a part of your training on illness and injury is really important because it reduces the risk of human pathogens, blood, or other bodily fluids from contaminating fresh produce, fields, and packing houses. And every time I think about these issues, I'm always reminded that agriculture and food production can be a dangerous profession. It's quite common for people to cut themselves or to somehow injure their hands or other parts of their body while they're actually engaged in agriculture. And it can be such a, if you will, a dangerous profession that there are actually a couple of training programs and funding opportunities through the National Institute of Food and Agriculture that focus just on farm safety on the farm. And those didn't come about by accident. They came about because the likelihood of being injured on a farm is actually pretty high. And so it's just important to remember that the people who come on your farm regularly and your workers are it's really important to pay attention to their needs for proper training. And the reason why is we can't really assume that everybody gets the same level of training on hand washing or how to handle injuries at home. And so we have to assume, or at school for that matter. So we have to assume that it's our responsibility as the owner or operator or manager of a farm to really make sure everybody's kind of at a level playing field and on the same page. While we're on this slide, I just wanted to share with you, there's a couple of examples and we're going to post these on our website as kind of additional resources that you can take a look at. But ever so often there will be basically a case study written up of some foodborne illness outbreak that demonstrates issues related to a particular area that the federal government has decided to regulate within. One of these that we will post later, and it's actually included in some of your slides, is a couple of studies that were done around an outbreak of hepatitis A back in the early 2000s. And it came from farming operations in Mexico, but they had high levels of import of green onions, literally, into the US, particularly during certain growing seasons. And these case studies really explain in a pretty detailed way how the illnesses emerged and were found out at the hospital level in the US, and then how those illnesses were traced back to literally farms in another country, and then how the actual activities that caused the human pathogens to emerge into the harvested crops and then make their way to markets, how that actually happened. And in these particular circumstances, the case studies revolved around hepatitis A. And you would not, some of these issues that arise, as I always read the case studies, I just pray that none of the tribal producers I know ever have to deal with those issues, because these studies actually talk about how much loss happens in terms of product that can't be harvested because the actual operation is implicated in this foodborne illness outbreak, how much they lose their market when that happens, but also it kind of unpacks in these case study, discussions, how the workers became ill and then how they actually passed it through hands contacting the actual green onions themselves. And so I just think that those kinds of, case studies, and it almost, no one wants to read about somebody else's, bad experiences, but it is so helpful when you're thinking about food safety to really, make yourself walk through some of these case studies so you can see how easily these things happen, and then what kind of damage they can put into the world around it. And in that particular circumstance, there were hundreds of people who were made ill in markets in another country here, but there were also people who passed because of the exposure to hepatitis A. So it really is important that we think about everything that we can do to actually keep our farms as safe and free from those problems as possible. This slide talks a little bit, just gives you a visual representation of the various routes of contamination. Obviously, feces, or as my son loves to call it, poop, can contaminate produce directly if the workers or volunteers or anybody you have on your farm actually defecates or poops in the field itself, or if there is a leak in a sewage system that is related or close to the operation itself. Workers' hands can also cross-contaminate produce if they don't wash their hands after using the toilet or returning from a break after eating or smoking and then handling produce. Another example of indirect contamination can occur when the worker's clothing is contaminated, for example, by animal feces that can be transmitted to covered produce or food contact services. And when working with animals or handling manure, workers do need to use protective outer garments, something like, overalls or coveralls or aprons or something to protect their clothing from contamination, because the migration of that feces into fresh produce occurs a lot. Injuries can result in blood or other bodily fluids contaminating produce, so it's really important to stress worker safety on the farm. And then workers can also contaminate tools or equipment if proper hygiene practices are not involved while they're actually using the tools and equipment. Footwear literally folds under the common, definition of clothing, but footwear can literally track feces from animals or humans back into the produce itself. So, just looking on your produce fields as these wonderful treasures that they are, and making sure that you do whatever you can to ensure that the safety is maintained of those fields is really important. With regard to illness and injury, I just keep, almost every time we do a training, someone reminds me of someone who tells a story of a worker who's either out in a field or who is inside maybe a value-added food production system, just a small operation, and they get cut by something, and instead of actually staying exactly where they are and calling for someone to help in terms of getting Band-Aids or whatever is necessary to treat the cut, they literally take their bleeding hand and walk through the field or walk through the value-added plant or the packing house. So basically when they do that, they have the potential for spreading whatever is happening in their own body throughout that field and throughout that particular packing house or whatever value-added, manufacturing that you have going on. So just being mindful that first aid is really, really an important concept and something you need to think about. The importance of training workers cannot be overstated. Fresh fruits and vegetables often receive no additional processing, such as cooking. In the food safety arena, that's called a kill step. Basically, a kill step is literally a step in the processing of the food that actually amounts to a killing of the pathogens. But when you're dealing with fresh fruits and vegetables, you don't often have a kill step. So, such as processing or cooking before it's actually eaten by the consumer. So pathogens that can contaminate produce can cause foodborne illness if they are consumed, and not addressed only because there is no kill step. And so workers themselves are critical to any farm food safety plan because they are responsible for using the food safety practices that you want them to use every day while they work. Food safety practices are learned. They're just not innately in your person. You either learn them at home as you're growing up, or you learn them in school, or you learn them on the job. And so we can't assume that every worker or visitor that we deal with or people who are regularly on our farm have the same level of learning that happens with regard to food safety practices. So it's really important to think about your training protocol and what you're going to actually do. Training challenges. A lot of folks will talk about there just isn't any time for training, but it's one of those things that doesn't take a lot of time to do, and you just have to be mindful and actually carve out the time for the training. It can present challenges though when you're implementing your farm's food safety plan. Time is money, so taking time to actually train workers means an investment in food safety. And making time for the training may mean training right when the workers are hired, and then committing time each week or each month to remind people about key food safety issues. Training sometimes needs to be provided in multiple languages. That's going to be different for every farm. So just making a note that just being thoughtful about the languages that are used by the folks who you regularly have on your farm, and making sure that food safety training occurs at a level that they understand because it is in their language. It also needs to be provided at multiple literacy levels and understanding levels. You might also consider doing training mid-season. When you're at a period where you're high activity level, sometimes you just feel like you don't have time to do the training, but that's also when the highest incidence of foodborne illness will happen. And so just carving out again those times is very important, and being creative about it so that it sticks in people's heads. Variation in the hygiene practices and expectations can occur, farm to farm and person by person. So making sure that you try to get the folks you're dealing with on the same page is really, really important. And, being mindful about how people learn. Sometimes you can get over a concept around food safety very easily by picture. And there's a lot of resources that are out there on the web that are literally small posters that you can place in key locations that literally remind people in a visual way what the proper food safety requirement might be. And so just if you ever run into the need for that, then just reach out to us and we can help you find as many examples of those as is possible. Some farms bring in additional labor at the height of a harvest. Some farms don't. So just being mindful about your new workers and when they come on and what their needs for training might be. That's really important. And we'll get into also again later on, but there is such a wide variety of human practices with regard to hygiene. In some locations where I grew up, toilet paper did not go into the toilet. It was you couldn't because the toilet system and the sewer system literally could not handle it. And so everybody's farm is different, and where you are and what you have the infrastructure to support is going to be different farm to farm. And so just being mindful about where your workers live and how they commonly get into habits around their own personal hygiene that is literally in many cases a function of where they're living So it's just important to know that, I don't have to tell anybody on this phone call about it, but plumbing is not the same everywhere. My husband used to be a plumber, and he reminds me of this all the time. And so just being mindful as the manager or owner or operator of a farm, that folks come and help you from a variety of different backgrounds, and just making sure, again, that they're all on the same page with regard to your farm and what they're doing with you on that farm is just really critical. Again, many times you're working with adults. Sometimes you're not going to be. Sometimes you're working with young people within your tribe or in your community who are working on food issues with you. So just be aware that training should be relevant to the jobs and their daily tasks. People need to know what your expectations are, and the training itself that you provide them should be done through a variety of methods, written or verbal or visual. And you need to be responsible as the manager for providing it on a regular basis. Again, good communication supports food safety by improving the risk identification and reduction. If you've got regular training about some of these practices, they may seem redundant to you, but the more redundant they are, the more they get into people's heads, and the more they become part of their, common practices that they do as people who are in this with you. They become better capable of identifying food safety risks. They know better how to reduce the risks that they see. They know and understand, without hesitation, who to call if they see a food safety risk that they cannot deal with, and that and then they also know that you're in it together. That food safety concerns are going to be taken seriously, and you're going to do this kind of hand in glove with the folks who are with you all the time. And so that communication piece is very, very important. Implementing food safety practices is and this slide talks about a company-wide task, and that can be anything. It's a garden-wide task. It's a tribe-wide task. Managers, farm workers, office staff, volunteers, interns, family members, whoever's going to be in contact with those fields really does need to be on the same page. And again, this is one of those areas where everybody's farm and everybody's produce production areas are different. So you really need to tailor what your approach is to your reality. But everyone who comes in contact needs to know how to identify and reduce the food safety risks that they may see, the practices they're responsible for doing, and how to report food safety risks that they see. Again, the only way you can actually do this is through training and recording your training and making sure that you keep a good record that these training and your policies are in place, and that folks have every opportunity to understand what those are and really comply. If you look down in the right-hand corner, right above the number 10 on your slide, you're going to see a symbol. That symbol is a section sign for a section in the law. And every time you see one of those symbols in the corner of these slides, you're going to know that this is actually written into the law, the Food Safety Modernization Act law, and the official regulations that implement the law. So anytime you see that symbol, your eyes should like literally go to it and make a note of it. And particularly if you copy off these slides and just keep them in a book, they're at your operation headquarters or at your house or at your tribal headquarters, I would take a yellow highlighter and just make sure that you can visually pick up that this is one of those areas where the law and the regulations themselves require some activity. So what is that activity? All workers that handle or contact covered produce, which means the fresh produce that we're talking about for this whole training series, or that supervise activities on the farm, must be trained. That is a requirement in the law. everyone who works on the farm should understand the company's basic food safety policies. So whether that's a community garden or whether it's a working farm or any other size or a characteristic, including a greenhouse, you need to have some protocol in place that is required by FSMA itself. Paid workers, volunteers, interns, anybody who is a family member can impact the safety of fresh produce. If you have people who come onto your farm on a regular basis, they can impact the safety of fresh produce. So anyone on the farm who doesn't wash their hands properly can contaminate that produce or can contaminate the food contact surfaces. Like when you actually harvest and then move your harvested product into a packing area or into a boxing area, some of those areas where they're out of the field, but they're in a food contact surface area. So all of those kind of places are capable of being pathogen environments. And so making sure that you have a training protocol is extremely important, and is not only just important, it's required under the law. But again, every time you see one of those section signs, just be aware that the information on those slides is particularly required by the law. So, and in addition to the training requirements for your workers and for anybody who supervises your workers, the law also requires that at least one supervisor from the farm complete food safety training at least equivalent to the standardized curriculum recognized by FDA. This curriculum will comply with that. So if you have an operation, you need to be considering attending one of our grower trainings that we're putting on or that somebody else is putting on in your region. This PSA, Produce Safety Alliance curriculum, complies with the legal requirements under the law. And so it's just very important. You don't necessarily have to send every single one of your workers through the grower training, although we have done trainings and attended trainings where an operation literally brings everybody. And so that is a decision you need to make. But that's also part of the reason why we're actually standing these trainings up, because it's important to offer these in such a way that folks have access to them. Visitors. There's a lot of agritourism and community-supported agriculture even or U-pick operations. There's a lot of things happening in agriculture and food right now that are really trying to pull people back onto the farm that aren't normally there, so that they can literally experience the food production environment and get a greater appreciation and understanding for fresh food, and literally develop relationships around that food. But basically what you're doing when that happens, and I've advocated in support of those kinds of activities for 30 years, but you are bringing people into your farm operation. And so when you do that on a regular basis, you really need to be mindful that many of your visitors are going to walk in and not have any idea about food safety. They're just there to have the experience, or they're there to talk with you, or they're there to actually pick fresh fruit or fresh vegetables, and they may not have any exposure to food safety policies, FSMA, food safety protocol, any kind of training requirements. So what that means, and here again in the corner, you'll see there's a section sign there. It's really important if you're one of those farms that is really actively having a lot of visitors coming onto the farm, you've got to be doing something to make them aware of food safety policies that are important for you. And so access to toilet and hand washing facilities is important, because if folks are out there and they're having fun with their families and they're doing things to help you with your farm, if they don't have access to toilet and hand washing, then you're basically setting in motion something that's going to be a problem for you down the road in terms of the potential for foodborne pathogens to arrive with the visitor and literally create problems for the produce itself. So there's a lot of ways to kind of attack the issue of visitors. One of them is that you could have posters or handouts or short policy summaries, or verbally tell people when they enter the farm that they're entering an area that food safety is really important to you, and that there's some key concepts that really they should, you know, comply with. But that's, sometimes we hesitate, I think, sometimes to come off too preachy to people who are visiting our farm, particularly when we're wanting them to become more involved in their food. But at the same time, if we don't kind of share this knowledge with them, then we could set in motion something that could make them or other people sick. And I don't think anybody on this call or anybody I know who's doing food anywhere in Indian country wants to do that. And so I just think, just figure out what works for you, what works for what you want to do, but also what works to get the word across to the visitors. If there's areas of the farm that you really don't want them to visit, maybe that produce is in a particularly vulnerable period right before harvest, and you just don't want to run the risk of any foodborne pathogens, you know, coming in contact. Maybe that area is just off limits for certain times of the year. Think about that. It's really important for folks to you know, be told if they're visiting the farm that you would really love for them to be there, but maybe they need to come back when they're not sick. And so when people come on your farm and they're visibly ill, or could run the risk of vomiting or having to access an area, they have maybe diarrhea going on or some other temperature related illness or infection, those are pathogens that can literally seep into your production system. Making sure that they have a place they can wash their hands and use the restroom is really important. And then one of the areas that a lot of folks have trouble with is that folks who come out and visit actually want to bring their dogs. And I've never seen too many cats come to an agritourism site or to a U-Pick site, but I could be surprised. But you know, if you're gonna not restrict pets from coming onto the property, then you got to figure out how you're going to handle them while they're there, because you know, those are not your animals. And so it's really important to think about how you're going to deal as a policy matter with folks who come onto the farm regularly and bring their pets. And you know, service dogs are different because they are trained in a different way, but you know, animals and pets are really kind of I don't know, an alarm system, if you will, because unless you are monitoring them pretty closely, they can run into the fields and defecate and really create some additional problems. So just if you're having these regular folks onto your farm as visitors, like through customers in a U-Pick, or people coming as a school group, or you know, agricultural tour groups or something like that, just you know, make yourself go through the process of trying to figure out how you want to handle their exposure to the produce, and how you're going to make them aware of your policies and what they should try to do to help you keep food safety at the highest level possible. Again, if you'll notice this slide, training programs, and we're going to shift back into dealing with your workers. There's a section of the law that specifically requires that all personnel who handle covered produce, which are these fresh fruits and vegetables, or that supervise the conduct of such activities, must receive training that includes principles of food hygiene and food safety, the importance of health and personal hygiene for personnel or visitors to the farm, including recognition of symptoms of a health condition that is reasonably likely to produce some sort of foodborne contamination. And then other training relevant to the worker's job is required by other sections, and we go into those in those appropriate sections. Again, this is an area that is required under the law. The training programs must be appropriate for the job and conducted upon hiring and include refresher training throughout the season, or at least annually, or when a problem arises. Every time a problem is identified and arises, that's a great learning opportunity for the folks who are working with you on your farm. It can't be so complicated that it's not easily understood. A qualified person, what that term means is a qualified person is somebody who has been through for instance, a grower training such as we're offering, or some other comparable training. But it's got to be, your training has to be supervised by somebody who's gone through training themselves. And you've got to include some sort of record keeping process for documenting who went through the training when, and just this, it's not an overly burdensome level of record keeping. It literally is just keeping track of when you trained, who was there, what you covered, who was there that was a supervisor, etc. And so those training programs, again, must contain those components, and that is in the law. There's some worker qualifications. Workers and supervisors must be qualified to conduct their job duties through education, training, and experience. That is also in the law. Again, this really kind of makes you go back and think about your hiring practices or your interview practices for actually bringing folks on in a regular sort of worker status, even if they're an intern or a volunteer. If they're regularly engaged in your operation, you need to think about how you put them through their paces for food safety training, but also what kind of training you give them as to their regular job duties, because it isn't just enough most times to just train as to food safety. You really need to think mindfully about what you're assigning people to do, and if they've been properly trained to actually perform what you want them to do. These requirements apply also to temporary helpers, part-time workers, seasonal workers, contracted workers. And I would suggest to you that many operations, particularly smaller operations, have volunteer workers, and those are also required to be trained properly in food safety and identification of foodborne illness issues. Again, this is another section, the training workers to identify and reduce risks at harvest. This is an area that's also required under the law. The law requires that persons who conduct harvest activities for covered produce must receive training that includes all of the following. They've got to be able to recognize covered produce that must not be harvested. In other words, they've got to be able to identify crops that are right at harvest but have been damaged somehow, so that the skin, for instance, of the particular crop has been perforated so that there is the potential for a pathogen to enter. If there's extensive animal tracks in and around the produce itself as it's being grown, or if there's actually the presence of fecal matter on the actual produce itself, being able to evaluate those risks of contamination before and during harvest has to be included in how you actually talk to your workers about the food safety issues. There is a requirement under the law that harvest produce destined for a fresh market that is visibly contaminated with feces cannot be used for that purpose. In other words, you can't harvest produce destined for a fresh market. It is visibly covered or contaminated with feces. a lot of folks would assume that that's, common sense. But a lot of folks don't. And so just know that this is a part of the law. And it is, if you actually look at some of the case studies of foodborne illness problems, and problems that have led to farms being shut down or liability tracing back to the farm, some of it actually has to do with feces that has been contaminating the produce itself that wasn't addressed at harvest. It was allowed to enter the fresh market, and that's literally not allowed under the law. Dropped produce can be a very interesting issue because it really it requires you to actually think about what it is you're growing. Dropped produce, that literally is produce that's dropped on the ground, does not include root crops that grow underground, and it doesn't include crops that grow on the ground, or produce that is intentionally dropped to the ground as a part of harvesting. And so this idea here under the law that you should never harvest dropped produce literally does not apply. That piece of the puzzle does not apply to produce that falls into one of those categories. It's a root crop that grows underground. It's a crop that is grown on the ground. Or it's produce that is intentionally dropped as a part of the harvesting process. So just keep in mind that dropped produce issue has some kind of different treatment under the law here. And then it's also important to think about when you're harvesting or packing, that you're for transmittal to a market or even to some other use, such as farm to school or some other delivery process that you're using for that fresh produce. You've got to use clean harvest and packing containers for that part of the puzzle. Reinforcing food safety training. This slide gives you one of those potential posters that are out there that you can use. Posting signs and reminders is a great way to keep people aware. Using appropriate language for whoever is working on your farm is important. I don't know about you, but pictures are always better for me than words. It's so much easier to transmit some of these ideas through the pictures on a poster than through the words themselves. But it's important to, again, continue reviewing and refresher training sessions throughout the season or when a problem arises, and mix it up to keep information relevant and interesting to the folks you work with. As a farm owner or manager, it's important to realize that you have a need to provide the following resources for workers. And again, this is a part of the law. Toilets or some access to an ability to access a toilet. Some of the toilets can actually be on a very small farm, can actually be in the house, and that's okay. But you have some protocol that you've got to comply with regards to toilet paper and paper towels or some means to wash people's hands. If you use toilets, particularly such as porta potties that are shown in that picture below, accessing toilet paper, water, soap, and paper towels is necessary, but if it's not provided, you've got to provide an alternative that gets to the same issue. It's important also to provide garbage cans, first aid kits, and areas where workers can take a break without introducing contamination to the fresh produce. But again, these facilities can be located inside a home or office so long as the same resources are provided that are listed here. It's another thing also to remember, reusable towels are literally not allowed under the law and regulations here because there is a risk of transferring pathogens from one person to the other if everybody's using the same towel. And some people might not want to do paper towels, but there are other options that are literally not reusable, but one-use cloths. sometimes when people go to the hospital, you might get little containers, and I see them when I shop all the time, that are literally not paper, but they're a reusable, not a reusable, but they're a one-use towel sort of washing capability. The important thing here is, some of these things might seem, just common sense, and we shouldn't have had them in a regulation, but they are important, and there are instances where they've not been provided to workers or to people coming onto a farm. And so when they're not provided, you're basically creating a vector, if you will, for potential foodborne pathogens to take hold in your operation. So the law does require toilets, toilet paper, soap, clean water, paper towels, a container to catch wastewater, garbage cans, first aid kits, and break areas. That is literally in the law and regulations. The law also requires that when toilets are provided for workers, they got to be reasonably accessible to the growing areas during harvest. They got to be designed, located, and maintained properly. They got to be designed in such a way that they prevent contamination of produce or food contact services. They've got to have access, at least nearby, to some sort of water that you can wash your hands in. And they got to be accessible for servicing and cleaning, so that at a sufficient frequency, so that you can ensure that the toilets are suitable for human use. And you've got to also consider how you're going to provide for the sanitary disposal of waste and toilet paper. The law also requires that hand washing facilities have soap, running water, and adequate drying devices. Again, that can be paper towels, it can be towel services. That seems a little expensive to me, but some operations use that. It can be electric hand dryers if you have that accessibility issue. Again, it can take a number of forms, but a lot of folks just prefer to use the single-use towel options, or the paper towels, to actually get the job done here. The next slide also talks about providing a sufficient number of toilets and sinks to meet worker and visitors' needs. OSHA actually requires one facility per 20 workers within a quarter mile of the working area. That is literally in OSHA regulations. And OSHA also requires that the facilities have to be fully serviced on a regular schedule. Toilet and hand washing facilities need to be stocked properly. And the facilities, somebody on your operation should be monitoring those every day when they're in use by people who are particularly harvesting or doing daily work on your farm. Again, this is one of the areas that is in FSMA and in the regulations, but as you can see, there is also a tying in of what's in FSMA and the regulations back into what is also in OSHA requirements. Again, I think it's also important for you to think about what are your tribe's policies in this area. Does your tribe have separate tribal law or regulations or requirements that mirror or exceed even OSHA requirements? So I think it's really important for some farms to think through what your tribe requires as well, because there could be a separate set of regulations that are out there that your tribe has decided to put on the books themselves. Drinking water and break areas, really important for people to have access to drinking water. It reduces the risks of heat exhaustion, and if we need water, and the break areas, we need access to some sort of break area, and it needs to be in a designated area, mainly because you can then kind of segregate the people who are working in your fields or working in your packing houses or whatever from the actual potential surface areas that the produce might come in contact with. And so just keeping people healthy is really important. Food work can be hard work, and making sure that people have proper hydration can literally keep them healthy, which in turn keeps their bodies in such a position so that they don't actually become more susceptible to human pathogens that might impact them, and then they in turn carry it back into your fields and operations. So it's very important for you to think about what your workers need in terms of drinking water. OSHA requires that potable water should be provided and placed in locations readily accessible to all employees. And furthermore, there is some requirement here for single-use cups. If you do want if you're going to provide cups for your workers, you need to think about what they are, and requiring, some folks will want to bring their own containers, which is fine. But if they do, you need to make sure they're not glass, because glass is one of those things that can drop and break, and then it can then scatter a wide variety of problems that are not foodborne illness related particularly, but are glass particle related, and can create a whole separate set of issues for you. You've got to also check your state and local regulations if they impact your tribal operation. In many cases, they're not going to, but they could. And some state and local laws actually allow for water to be substituted by other hydration fluids. And so, just be aware and mindful where your farm is and what kinds of laws it is covered by. And also in this particular area, the law and regulations also require that eating chewing gum or using tobacco products in an area where you've got produce happening, harvest happening, or packing happening is not acceptable. And the law allows you to be able to drink water and beverages in that area, but it doesn't allow you to bring other foods into the area or use tobacco products that could then create some additional problems in transmitting pathogens. The training versus practices. The produce safety rule has some very specific requirements for training and for practices that workers have to follow. And it's important that the folks that you work with understand what they're required to do. And that can only come through training programs and giving them the resources they need to actually follow the best practices that are important for your particular operations. Again, it's just be mindful that this whole training piece is extremely important. And what we're talking about today, I'm literally giving you a set of requirements that are in the law and regs, things to think about that could be best practices, but also then how do you actually put these into motion? And that's through your training. Again, this slide talks a little bit more about the requirements for workers. Workers have to maintain personal cleanliness. Again, you've got your section code in the very corner of the slide here, which means it is in the law and regs. They got to avoid contact with animals other than working animals. If you do allow them to wear gloves or want them to wear gloves, the gloves have to be maintained in a sanitary condition and replaced if they become torn or capable of having some sort of transmittal through being worn too much or torn. It's important also, if you don't have your workers wearing gloves, to have them think about and remove or cover any hand jewelry that they have that can't be readily cleaned. Again, those kind of surface areas around jewelry can literally carry pathogens into your produce if you're not careful. Again, I've already mentioned previously this admonishment to eating chewing gum or using tobacco in an area used for handling your produce, and then notifying your supervisor if they're ill, and then reminding them constantly that they need to do as good a job as they can to wash their hands. That notifying your supervisor if they're ill, a lot of folks are very hesitant to do that. If you have paid workers, they may not want to actually report to you when they're not feeling well, because it may impact their number of hours that they're going to be paid for, during that particular pay period. If you have the flexibility to actually move them to another activity that needs to be done, that's away from the produce, but it's still on the farm, and allow them to, work their hours, that's an acceptable way to approach this. But we've been to trainings where folks who manage packing areas, where produce is further handled after harvest as it's getting ready to be transmitted. And they just are adamant that when their workers come in and they're visibly sick, they just have to send them home, because they can't be assured of what illness they are carrying, not to just other workers, but capable of being sneezed or transmitted to the produce itself. So, so just being mindful of those issues. Hand washing. And a lot of you, I know, if you travel as much as I do, you go into a restroom anywhere and you've got signs all over the place about how to properly wash your hands and when they need to be washed. But according to the law with regard to produce, they got to be washed after using the toilet, before starting or returning to work, like after a break, before and after the workers or you do any sort of eating or smoking, before they put on gloves that they may wear during their activities, after they touch animals or any kind of animal waste, and any other time when their hands might become contaminated. Again, your section area thing is in the bottom corner of that slide. This is required under the law. And so just being mindful of that the law is very specific about hand washing and when it is required. And the best way to deal with this is to train folks about it, but also is to make it easy for them to comply. You'll also see in that picture that particular picture has porta potties that are the toilet requirements, but there's also a hand washing facility right next to it, and that's what that is. And we've been talking to other trainers in this area, and there's a lot of versions of a proper hand washing facility that can be constructed, very cheaply, and just literally be sitting there right next to the toilet, so you make it easy for people. But if you've got a porta potty situation out in your fields, but you don't have any sort of hand washing capabilities, then you've got a problem. And so be mindful and be thinking about various, options that you might have before you. And a lot of them can be very low tech. They just got to be accessible. Now, I know I can't even tell you how many times I've been trained on how to do proper hand washing, and I still have to make myself do it the right way, because we all get in a hurry and we all think we can do it quicker. But I know this may seem kind of basically too fundamental, but a lot of folks aren't properly trained about how to do proper hand washing to really cut down on bacteria or pathogens or things that could cause further problems, not just with the produce they handle, but with just their own human health. So the steps are here. Wet your hands with water, apply soap and leather. Be sure to wash the fronts and backs of the hands as well as in between the fingers. Rub the hands together for at least 20 seconds. And it's kind of interesting here, because some of the trainings that we have been working with other people on, there's some like tips that folks have on what it means to wash your hands for 20 seconds. And some folks say that you can measure the 20 seconds by singing the happy birthday song in full, or doing your ABCs twice, or choosing some other song that you can sing to yourself while you're that lasts about 20 seconds. And I'm struck by that because a lot of us do it way less than 20 seconds. And so this is just an important piece of the puzzle for you to train folks that work with you, your family members, your tribal members who are exposed to the produce, et cetera, that there is an accepted level of time that it's been proven that if you can really actually, hand wash for that length of time, it does the best job for tamping down any sort of problems that may arise. And that actual friction of rubbing your hands together for that length of time is literally the most effective way to deal with some of the pathogens that might be present on your hands. Rinsing is very important thereafter. And then drying with a paper towel, or like I said previously, a single-use towel of some sort. And then throwing the paper towel in a trash can is really important, because you don't want to just, use the towel, spread the pathogen onto the towel, but then leave it out in such a way that it can be reused or picked up by some others. Antibacterial hand sanitizers cannot replace hand washing. That has been proven scientifically that it just is not the same. It's the actual friction of the water and the soap that actually does the best job to actually rid your hands of the potential for the pathogens being there and being transmitted. There's also some pretty cool things. If you, I don't think this is actually in a slide, but if you'll go to www.glowgerm.com, I went there again last night just to look at their array of products, and they've got some really cool products that you can use to show the folks that work with you all the time what is effective. And it literally is a hand washing exercise that uses ultraviolet light, like a glow light, and can show you whether there are still problem areas left on your hands after washing. And so go to that website and take a look, because it is a pretty interesting way to think about training your workers. Their products are not that expensive. I ran across one that had like 20 uses for a particular setup. It was the ultraviolet light, it was the actual glow germ itself, but it had some training modules that went with it. So they have a full array of ability, and FDA actually, refers to them in their materials because they are pretty effective in terms of proving to people the importance of hand washing. So it is, again, it's Glow Germ, GLOGERM, and you can find them online and just take a look. There could be there's lots of other ways to do this training. But again, it's one of those pieces of the puzzle that can be kind of fun when you're training about it. I'm not sure, it might be a little bit more fun to do Glow Germ than it is to do like having all of the people who work on your farm sing happy birthday in full. But there's a lot of ways to approach this. And the important thing is that you do it. Proper use of toilets. Again, this may be very obvious. When you're out in the field and you are using porta potties or other toilets accessible to you or your workers, all urination and defecation should be done in a toilet, but never in the field or nearby production areas. That's just so just basic common sense. You just got to not let that happen in your production areas. Disposal of the toilet paper is going to be unique to where you are and what kind of toilet situation you got set up. but it's really important to think about making sure that you've got proper receptacles that are available to folks, so that your toilet paper doesn't end up on the floor. And then washing your hands and having that hand washing station close by is really, really important. And it's got to be close enough to the toilet facilities themselves that it's usable. And again, as we talked about earlier, those can be in the home. If that's your only location, then so be it. But you still need to actually bring the requirements that are required under the law into your own home toilet to make sure that the workers and other visitors actually can do it properly. Worker clothing. It's really important to think about and encourage anybody who comes onto your farm to do so with some level of cleanliness in their clothes themselves, because those can carry pathogens. So designated footwear, going back to one of those early slides that we did, early on in this slide deck, it had a picture of boots. And so maybe you're a farm that actually requires or has encourages people to wear boots when they're out working on the production fields. Again, it's so important to make sure that they're maintained properly, but that they're also stored properly. They're cleaned ever so often, and that you don't kind of encourage cross-contamination by the boots themselves and where they've been. Gloves, I mentioned earlier, again, if they're worn, they don't have to be worn, but if they are, they got to be changed and cleaned from time to time and repaired as needed. Again, aprons, gloves, and other food safety equipment, you don't have to use it, but if you do, it's got to be removed before using the toilet, and it should be stored in a clean, designated area when it's not in use by your workers. Again, this is going to be one of those things that's so specific to your particular operation. You just got to think through how the folks working in your fields actually present themselves for work, and what you can do as the manager or operator or owner of that particular produce operation, what you can do to help them do whatever they can do to be as clean as possible when they're actually working in the fields, because of that issue of bringing in what is literally unseeable by the human eye, but can wreak havoc on food safety issues on your particular farm. Worker illnesses, again, we've gone over this already, but if you've got folks showing up who have nausea or vomiting, have diarrhea, fever, or some appearance of jaundice, then you've got a problem on your hands. And if you allow them to work that day in the fields, then there is really no way that you can ensure that what they are suffering through is not further passed to the produce itself. So just be mindful of the health of your workers when they show up, and if you can, and they're concerned about losing the hours, which a lot of people are, it's just really important to think through what else there's always things to do on a farm, and it's just what is it that you can have them do that can help them keep working but not around the produce. That's the really important part, is they could be carrying a communicable disease. If you remember back to my example and the case study around hepatitis A, people don't walk around with a hepatitis A stamp across their forehead. It literally is an illness that just is almost impossible to detect in the person as they're moving through their day. And so you've got to just be mindful to keep an eye on your folks and make sure that they're doing everything they can do to remain healthy. But when they are feeling ill, that you either send them home or you've got to deal some way with them so they don't further contaminate the produce, because some of their illnesses could be communicable into the produce itself. And that is going to create a lot of problems for you. Worker injury, again, first aid kits, you can pick them up for not very much money. Just having them available, stocked and ready to go. If you've got wounds that happen while your folks are actually harvesting or working with the produce, they've got to not drip blood throughout the field or throughout the packing house or whatever. Just making sure that those first aid kits are accessible, everybody knows they're around. Just make sure that your folks know where they are and they can call out for help if they need help to actually get treated and continue working. A lot of farm injuries are not major enough to call for stopping them from working, but you don't want them to work with open wounds. That's just not a good idea for the produce itself. You've got to also think about any produce that might be contaminated when your worker is injured. Sometimes that can happen literally on, some, production line where you're cutting something, and the blood may have spilled to pieces of the produce that you're going to have to throw those away. You cannot put those into a market environment, or you cannot send those to, your school where your kids are going to eat that produce. So cleaning and sanitizing any items that come in contact with bodily fluids is really important, and reporting injuries to your supervisor is important. Again, these seem common sense, but it's really important to train people to what your expectations are, and also to keep some records. For instance, you might want to have a record that would allow you to literally, like every month, check your first aid kit and just make a notation that you checked it. It was full, it was ready to go, it was available, it was stocked, it was where it was supposed to be, it wasn't out of Band-Aids or other necessary items. So just keeping that simple record and just putting it in your files will pay benefits later if something happens and your farm is actually implicated in a foodborne illness outbreak. Monitoring processes is really important, particularly with regard to worker health and hygiene practices and the sanitary facilities. Just making sure that you've figured out for your particular operation what makes sense for how often and when and who is going to do monitoring of the physical layout of your farm, so that you can keep a record of, you checked it on that day, the facilities were there, they were available, they were clean, they were in working order, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody's got to be in charge of actually following through on this monitoring component. And that includes training supervisors to observe employee behavior and appointing someone to check the facilities. Toilet facilities for sure need to be checked every day, just to make sure that you've got the equipment you need there and they're in clean working order. And monitoring logs, that's just, all that means is just some simple form of record keeping that will allow you to actually keep track that somebody took a look at it. If you've ever gone traveling like I do all the time, and you pull over at some convenience store or something, there's usually, and in a lot of restaurants, are literally logs on the back of the door in a restroom facility that literally show that somebody came in and checked that facility, and it's got when that happened, it's got the employee's initials or their name, and and some check mark that it was in good order. So take a look at those the next time you go on a trip and actually see what they put in their monitoring logs. It doesn't have to be elaborate, but that kind of record is extremely important for you to literally have on hand and keep track of. It'll help you keep on top of things. Corrective actions need to be thought through too, because ever so often you're going to have either a worker or some accident happen, and it's going to be a problem. And you're going to need to identify that the problem happened in your records, but you also need to be mindful that you need to say in your records what you did to correct the problem. That shows your attention to detail, and it also shows your attention to food safety requirements and needs of your particular operation. So just being mindful that it's not just enough to monitor. You've got to also self-correct, and that's literally one of the essences of the new FSMA rules is really working throughout all produce to make sure that we're doing a lot more self-monitoring against a set of, standard protocol or common sense practices, that we keep good records about it, and that we literally can self-correct when problems happen. So the worst that you could do is to have a problem, somebody notices it, you don't write it down, you don't make a record of any monitoring, you don't make a record of corrective action, and then some person who saw the problem reports it to somebody else, and all of a sudden you've got somebody knocking on your door accusing you of being of setting in motion a bad food safety practice. This example of the picture of a knocked over porta potty, somebody needs to be called on that one. If you don't have the workers, or you don't have the expertise to actually right that fallen porta potty and get it checked out so that it is functioning again, then you need to have your sanitation company contact on speed dial the porta potty company, so they can actually come out and correct the problem. Anyway, things happen, emergencies happen, spills happen, and sometimes things leak, and sometimes your plumbing breaks. So what is your plan for when things do go wrong? And what are you going to be putting in your records about that? And your farm food safety plan can actually help you get those sorts of things thought through. Nobody wants them to happen, but it is, but they do happen. And so actually thinking through now what your plan would be if some corrective action needs to take place because something emergency or some unforeseen circumstance happens, that being mindful and actually putting that in your plan, and then creating a system where you can keep an eye on those things and then monitor and keep a record that you fixed them, is really important for you being able to prove up if somebody actually comes knocking on your door about your practices, that you have done everything you can to actually keep your operation on the up and up. Record keeping, again, that's one of the pieces of the FSMA law and regulations that's so important. Documenting actions that you've taken to support worker health, hygiene, and training on the farm. Documenting that you've done training programs. Documenting that you have a system for illness and injury reporting. Documenting that you've checked your first aid kits and that you've restocked them properly. Documenting that you have monitored on a regular basis the toilet and hand washing facilities that you have and that you've restocked. Those are really simple forms that you can put in place, or logs that you can put in place, that don't take a lot of effort. The biggest effort they usually take is just actually getting them in place in the first place. But having the name of the task and the date and time that the task was completed, the name of the person who completed it, what was done, any materials that you used to complete the task, and then a signature for the person who's responsible for your food safety plan. All of those pieces of the record keeping puzzle are very, very important, and they are required. Again, the section sign in the corner of your slide, they are required under the law. Again, here are just two examples. Those are not terribly difficult or complicated forms, but they're just simple template record keeping logs. Again, our website is going to continue to curate and find these record keeping components, and we'll post them regularly. And these are just two examples that you're welcome to copy. But they don't have to be terribly complicated. They just have to be done. Again, this is a worker training log. If you include the date, the name of the trainer, the date of the training, the materials or the information you covered, and then who attended and who was the supervisor or manager of the operation, who either attended or was in charge of getting the training actually put in place. Those are worker training logs. They are required, and those are just simple logs that you can put in your files, and they can really help you make sure that you keep an eye on worker issues and make sure that you comply with all of the necessary requirements. So bottom line, and this is our last slide, worker health and hygiene is critical to food safety. Pathogens can be spread by a worker or a visitor. They can be spread by folks who don't wash their hands properly. There is, a good way and a proper way to wash your hands if you're handling produce. Pathogens can also be spread through saliva and mucus and contact with other contaminated surfaces. So just being mindful about the training of your employees on when and how to wash their hands. It's literally probably the most important thing that you can do. Your workers or your visitors, whoever works on your farm, needs to understand how to identify risks, how to reduce them, and how they can be actively participating in the farm food safety team. Approaching this as a team effort is really important so that everyone has the same level of knowledge, but they also have the same level of commitment to the goal of high levels of food safety, compliance, not just compliance with the law, but also just trying to be the best you can be around food safety issues relative to produce is really, really important. Workers are as important as the managers of a farm in this. They've got to be a part of the team. You've got to do whatever you can to make sure they're trained as properly as they can be and remain as committed as you are. Written training programs should be developed, implemented, and documented. Record keeping in this whole area is very, very important. We've gone over that a lot today. But at the end of the day, all of this needs to be incorporated into your farm food safety plan. This is one of the areas to me that's not that difficult to actually come to terms with, put in place, and make sure that you keep in order, because it is one that is not terribly complicated. And so that's it for today. And again, please use all of the resources, all of the training modules that we have that we're using. All of them have been approved by FDA and by the Produce Safety Alliance for use. This curriculum that you're taking part in today is curriculum that has been approved and will qualify you for receiving certificate of compliance with the actual requirements that have been put in place under the new FSMA. And so again, we've got other trainings that are coming up in the coming weeks and months. We're going to keep launching these and having them out there for your use. And we very much appreciate your participation. And if you've got any questions, we'll take them now, Brian, and you're welcome to field those questions to me. But anytime you want to actually post a question to us, just give us a call or send us an email, and we're happy to surface up the answer to that and help you in any way we can. So y'all, thanks for participating today, and we have more to come.
All right. Thank you, Janie. Just wanted to let everybody know, now's a good time to pose any questions that you might have for Janie. There's a couple ways that you can do that. The first would be to raise your hand, or you could just type a question into the questions box that's in your control panel. And anyone who has a question, Janie will answer it to the best of her ability. While you're thinking about your questions, I just want to remind everyone, the slide that is up right now has our food safety webpage on it, indigenousfoodandag.com/food-safety. If you go there, you'll see a complete list of the remaining webinars that we have in this section with links so that you can register for the webinars. You'll also find a listing of the cities where we will be having the in-person trainings where you can get a food safety certification. So I would definitely encourage you to visit our website. There's a lot of information there, including a growing resource library that has links to all kinds of online tools for business planning and all kinds of other things.
The other thing, Brian, I wanted to mention to folks who are participating is if you've got, 10 to 15 growers or 15 to 20 growers or workers that would benefit by us coming out and training with you, we posted a set of locations where we're going to do these one-day grower trainings. But if you all want to, do the hard work of lining up a set of folks who are interested in the trainings, then call us, email us, and we will come to you. We just tried to kind of throw a dart on the wall and try to position ourselves in as many kind of regional locations as we possibly could to do these sorts of trainings. But we're ready, willing, and able. We have to plan, obviously, for our, we can't come at the drop of a hat. We got to actually have a little bit of notice, but we can send our trainers out to literally do, a gathering just for you. But we got to work closely with you to do that. So just call us if you think that you could pull together, a good room full of folks who are interested in being trained, and we can work with you on setting that up.
All right. So I'm not seeing any questions. So with
this area is pretty. Brian.
Go ahead.
No, this whole subject matter area is pretty simple. I didn't really anticipate we'd have too many questions, but if we don't have a question in another minute or two, then we can just shut her down. And if anybody does think of something later, they can sure email us or reach out by phone.
Absolutely. I think that's an important point, that just because we close down this webinar, it does not mean you lose access to us. There's a phone number on your screen. You can call at any time, and we will get back with you, and we will help you in whatever way that we can. I did get a request for us to share our email and phone number. Like I said, the phone number is on the screen right now, 479-575-4434. And anyone that would like to just send an email, you can send your email to our food safety coordinator. Her name is Sandy Ham, and her email address is smartini, MARTINI, at uark.edu, or you can send an email to me at bpollard, POLLARD, at uark.edu. And it looks like that's all the questions that we have. So with that, I will conclude today's webinar. Thank you for attending, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.